Hello and welcome to EPG Epadshala. Today, in the paper Victimology and Victim Justice, we look into Module 5, which is Victim Recovery and Psychosocial Coping Model. The learning objectives of this module would be to understand the importance of victim recovery, to understand the concept of coping and coping strategies, to understand the individual adaptive traits, and to understand the theoretical background of the psychosocial coping model. The trauma of victimization is a direct reaction to the aftermath of crime. Crime victims suffer a tremendous amount of physical and psychological trauma. The primary injuries the victims suffer can be grouped into three distinct categories: physical, financial, and emotional. When victims do not receive appropriate support and intervention in the aftermath of crime, they suffer secondary injuries. The primary emotional injuries of victimization cause both immediate and long-term reactions to the victims, their loved ones, and sometimes their friends too. Importance of psychosocial issues in recovery. Emergencies create a wide range of problems experienced at the individual, family, community, and societal levels. Pre-existing social problems like extreme poverty, belonging to a group that is discriminated against or marginalized, political oppression are some of the issues that delay recovery. Emergency induced social problems like family separation, disruption of social network, destruction of community structures, resources and trust, increased gender-based violence, and humanitarian aid-induced social problems like undermining the community of structures or traditional support mechanism, and anxiety due to lack of information about food distribution. These problems of a predominantly psychological nature include mental disorder, alcohol abuse, grief, non-pathological distress, depression, anxiety disorders, including PTSD. So victim service providers need to understand the dynamics of trauma and the vital role victim service providers have in trauma response and victim rights advocacy. We have to remember that every victim is unique. Never make assumptions concerning how a victim will react. We have to recognize that a person's reaction in victimization will be influenced by a variety of factors, and try to identify the specific needs of individual victims and develop a plan to meet them. It's also important to know and use the wide range of community, cultural, and justice system resources to meet the various needs of victims. It's important also to become familiar with the culture and traditions of the population being served. What is coping? Coping is what persons do physically, socially, and cognitively to meet the demands of living after a victimization. The objective of coping is to reduce the stress brought about by the presence of a problem. Coping styles vary according to individuals, families, and culture. Some persons cope appropriately and others cope inappropriately. Appropriate coping is positive, engaging in constructive problem solving, task-focused behavior, while inappropriate coping is blaming oneself or others, denying that the problem exists, trying to cope with the use of drugs, alcohol, etc., and being aggressive. Now, research has shown that persons who cope appropriately have a better sense of well-being, they achieve better and are generally more successful in life. Those who cope inappropriately or maladaptively are not comfortable with themselves, they are low achievers, they have less success in their lives. So coping is highly individualistic. There are a few tips for coping. These include finding someone to talk with about how you feel, keeping the phone number of a good friend nearby to call when you feel overwhelmed, allowing yourself to feel the pain. It will not last forever. Spending time with others, but make time to spend alone as well. Taking care of your mind, body, with rest, sleep, and eating regularly, and eating healthy meals as well. Another way of coping would be by re-establishing a normal routine as soon as possible, but trying not to overdo it as well. Making daily decisions which will help bring back a feeling of control over your life. Exercising, though not excessively, and alternate with periods of relaxation. Undertaking daily tasks with care. Accidents are more likely to happen after severe stress. Finally, it helps recall the things that helped you cope during the victimization. Now let's look at positive coping strategies. Seeking information. Often victims of crime simply want information, details about the criminal justice system, the program options, and common reactions. Cognitive reframing of victimization. Self-comparison and emphasizing the positive aspects of having survived. In research on sexual assault victims, it is seen that they feel better by focusing on how they are now survivors. Put that into lay terms, that which does not kill you will make you stronger. Getting through a difficult situation successfully seems to help victims see themselves as strong, and tougher the situation, the greater the effect. Social comparison will also help. Victims will often compare themselves to other victims in an effort to make sense of what happened to them. They may look into victims who are doing well as an inspiration to keep going. This, in a way, is a double-edged sword, as they may also lose hope if they feel they aren't making similar progress. Another positive way of coping is through activism. It appears that some victims heal by becoming advocates or activists. They apply their experience on the social level, trying to change society so that it will create fewer victims or treat victims more fairly. For example, there is the support group called Mothers Against Drunken Driving. This is a support group that comprises of mothers who have lost their children as accident victims due to drunken driving. So this kind of a support group advocates the cause of victims and promotes the non-drinking and driving concept. Similarly, Alcoholics Anonymous. So these are ways in which the victims try to cope positively. Another way is the emotion-focused coping, which involves activities that try to directly change how the victim feels. These include positive thinking, relaxation, expression of emotions, distractions, etc. The perceived support versus actual support. Both actual support, going to a support group or meeting with a counselor, and perceived support, that is believing help is available if it is needed, help victims cope. Professional support versus natural support. Some victims report that they find their natural support more useful than professional support. However, in some cases, they may still prefer to rely upon professionals. Having looked at the positive coping strategies, let's now look at the negative coping strategies that are often used by victims. The first one would be active behavioral avoidance, such as not leaving one's apartment or taking time off work, avoiding victim services, avoiding therapists. This may allow victims to take time to heal and gather resources to rebuild their lives and deal with other challenges like the criminal justice system. Acting as a type of psychological avoidance, denial and self-deception work to help victims temporarily erase the memories. Disassociation is another negative coping mechanism. Disassociation is a clinical form that means there is a break in a person's normal way of thinking, memory, identity, or how he sees his environment. This cognitive change allows the victim to forget difficult elements of the crime or trauma and may result in reduced distress. Substance misuse or self-medication to avoid the pain are likely to experience even greater challenges, since using alcohol or drugs can often interfere with the decision making. Another method would be the confrontation, cognitively narrowing the focus when people are presented with complex stimuli. Their ability to process the information is weakened. But some people become overly focused on the traumatic event, ignoring everything else. Focused arousal may allow the victim to pay closer attention to the specifics of the crime. However, this focus can also cause problems for a person trying to move beyond the victimization experience because they are unable to focus on other aspects of his life. Another negative coping mechanism would be deliberate self-harm. It's non-suicidal, but it is self-harm all the same. Person deliberately causes harm and physical self-harm such as cutting or burning themselves, prostitution, substance abuse, eating disorders. High self-harm group report more problems with depression and disassociation. Now let's move on to the individual adaptive capabilities. A list of 8 adaptive capabilities include the following, but none of these capacities alone create a resilient person, but each may contribute to greater resiliency. The levels of capacity vary with every individual. A general understanding of them is useful, so they are consolidated and described in the following manner. Physical health and abilities, cognitive abilities, emotional capacity, education, experience, access to community and family support, self-esteem, spiritual connections, and personality. Now let's move to the psychosocial coping model. This model shows that the psychosocial coping starts with the coping milieu and an individual's personal resources. This coping uses the 5 personal resources that a victim has. One is the repertoire, one is the social assets, the psychic assets, the physical assets, and the time. The theoretical background of the psychosocial coping model is offered as a general theory for understanding all forms of victimization and for facilitating recovery. This model uses behavioral versus legal concepts. The primary goals are to be explanatory and utilitarian. Its roots are derived from social psychology, social control theory, stress theory, symbolic interactionism, and behaviorism. Now let's focus on the screen to see the diagram that illustrates this psychosocial coping model. A person trying to cope, that is coming to the coping milieu, comes with his personal resources. The more stronger the personal resources, the easier the coping. The person with his personal resources appraises the problem at hand and then begins the coping process. In the coping process, he uses the personal resources, and then if the successful coping process happens, then the person is said to have coped well. While using, if there is a lack of personal resources and the coping process then fails. So the feedback would be referring to the personal resources every time the problem has to be appraised. So the antecedent and the coping milieu provide the results as being successful coping or unsuccessful coping. So when a person comes with a problem and starts the coping, within a given milieu and armed with the personal resources, an individual confronts a problem and makes an appraisal. A problem is defined as a multidimensional force directed at a person that blocks status and or the pursuit of goals which creates physical, social, and psychological stresses. Each problem is made up of numerous continua, which in this model are considered at a moment in time. The problem moment is a heuristic device, that is, where one learns by oneself, by trial and error. This allows us to freeze time so as to evaluate each different continuum. In response to a problem, a person begins the coping process. The problem moment continua. First would be the due continuum, the time continuum for problem resolution, the length of the time a problem has existed, the person continuum, the number of persons in the problem, the severity continuum, the complexity of the problem, And last is the threat continuum, extent of threat to a person's well-being. Finally, we have the evolution continuum, the speed with which the problem became known. The familiarity continuum is the extent to which the problem is known to a person. The context continuum is the extent to which a problem is in or out of context. This psychosocial coping process, each phase is a continuum within which a person can make a choice, with failure more likely at one end and success more likely at the other end. This psychosocial coping process has 4 distinct phases. The first would be prevention, starts with the awareness that a problem is possible. The second would be preparation, starts with the awareness that a problem is imminent. The third is the action. Here it starts when the problem is present. The fourth would be the reappraisal, which starts after the problem is over. So the specific post-victimization conditions which facilitate recovery are the healing milieu, the positive intervention, the psychic strengths and the social strengths, the physical strengths, the time abundance, the developed coping system and the appropriate coping methodology. Resiliency's conditions cope well and have a high chance of recovery from their victimization. As a conclusion, victimization is an event whereby a person is unable to cope with a personal attack due to inadequate resources. Recovery is the state when a victim resumes a functional lifestyle with significantly fewer symptoms and adopts a positive identity of self. Inadequate resources result in vulnerability, victimization, and poor ability to recover. Adequate resources result in resiliency, safety, and an enhanced ability to recover. It is therefore both a clinical and a social policy task to incorporate a multidimensional and interdisciplinary framework in providing appropriate victim assistance to aid this post-victimization coping process. Furthermore, India, as a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, 1985, has a commitment to victims of crime and ought to show a political will to take forward the cause of victims and ensure access to justice and fair treatment, restitution, compensation, and assistance to victims as envisaged in the UN Declaration. This commitment would help the coping process of victims. Thank you.